At this juncture in our discussion of the epistemology of Immanuel Kant, I want us to do a comparison and contrast similar to what we did in our module on Revelation, Thomas, Kant, and Van Til, when it comes to the nature of knowledge, natural knowledge, or the character of theoretical reason. Now, let me review the main points of what we had to say first about Thomas Aquinas from a previous module. Thomas Aquinas taught, on the one side, that that Adam, as created, had a natural capacity to know God, but he had no created natural knowledge of God. Aquinas taught that there is a natural capacity to know God, but no concreated natural knowledge was given to Adam before the fall. Now let me remind you of the highlights of that. Thomas Aquinas taught that while there was no naturally implanted knowledge of God in Adam as the image of God, there was a naturally implanted, what we'll call here, what Thomas calls an inner light of reason, an inner light of reason. And by that inner light, there was a concreated capacity to know God as reason begins with sensible creatures and traces back to the existence of God. For Thomas, and here's a quote, if you remember from the Romans commentary 59 through 60, man's knowledge begins with things connatural to him, namely sensible creatures, which are not proportioned to representing the divine essence. For since these creatures are subject to change and decay, it is necessary to trace them back to some unchangeable and unfailing principle. In this way, it can be shown that God exists. So Thomas begins with sensible creatures, and he argues that it is necessary to trace back from those sensible creatures through an inferential pattern of reasoning and conclude with the knowledge of God. So the natural capacity of inner light can yield the knowledge of God at the end of an inferential process, but there is no concreated natural knowledge of God in Thomas's theology. It simply doesn't exist. One more quote. He says, God manifested knowledge to them by endowing them with the light, or from without by presenting visible creatures in which, as in a book, the knowledge of God may be read. That is also from page 60 of the Romans commentary. So what is this? The natural light of reason operating on sensible creatures can lead to the knowledge of God, but the knowledge of God is not given in the primal operations of creaturely knowledge. Reason has a capacity to discover God if used properly. Indirect and inferential knowledge is all that can be attained by reason. Now, what we said when we were contrasting Aquinas and Van Til in a previous module is that Van Til, here's Thomas, that Van Til, I'm going to try to get this a little higher here. I'm going to erase this. Van Til affirmed, one, a natural capacity, and two, Van Til affirmed natural, concreated, or naturally implanted knowledge of God. Now, what does that mean? Just by way of review, it means that Van Til agreed with Aquinas that there is an inner light of reason that is gifted to Adam as the image of God. He believed in a concreated inner light. But he did not believe in a bare inner light. He also believed in naturally implanted knowledge of God. Van Til, especially in the Survey of Christian Epistemology and in the development of a Calvinistic epistemology, following Warfield, developing Calvin, says that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of self are given in the same act of knowledge. There is an inescapable and ineradicable knowledge of God that is naturally implanted, naturally gifted, concreated. We've seen some of those quotes earlier. So we said when it comes to Thomas and Van Til, while there is agreement on natural capacity, there is no agreement on concreated natural knowledge. There is an actual antithesis, and that's what distinguishes a Reformed conception of natural theology, a Reformed conception of natural revelation, from a traditional Thomistic conception of natural theology. Then, in terms of the lecture from the other course, I just want to remind you of Karl Barth, and then I'm going to situate Kant here. Karl Barth said there is no, now this is in Those Who Have Fallen in History. Jim Cassidy could talk about Jesus Christ in Geschichte. But as far as fallen people in history go, there is no natural capacity to know God. There is no naturally implanted or concreated knowledge of God. Just to be symmetrical here, no concreated knowledge of God. Now, I do want to make an excursus here and just say this. In the previous module that Dr. Cassidy and I taught, Dr. Cassidy shows, and I think convincingly, that while Barth denies natural capacity, and while Barth denies concreated knowledge, he nonetheless has an autonomous natural theology, where individuals and the church have to work their way up from fallible witnesses to a revelation in a distinct time dimension. And it is, therefore, a species of natural theology. My point here is that although Barth had that natural theology functioning, in his own work he denied natural theology for those in fallen time and said there's no natural capacity, no concreated knowledge. Now, what I want to tell you about the Kantian proposal, and I think I'm going to put Kant just right here under the line. Kant argues, when it comes to theoretical reason, that while there is a natural capacity to know God, that if you use practical reason, there is a way to access God by way of ethical intuition. He denied that there is concreated natural knowledge. He denied that there's no concreated natural knowledge. Now, here's what I want you to see in terms of just this chart. When it comes to the relationship of Thomas, Van Til, and Barth, what we concluded in the Doctrine of Revelation module is that Thomas affirms natural capacity, denies concreated natural knowledge. Van Til affirms natural capacity and affirms natural concreated knowledge. And Barth denies both. He says there's no natural capacity, no concreated natural knowledge. And what is the conclusion? When it comes to naturally implanted knowledge of God, concreated knowledge gifted in and with the image, Karl Barth is closer to Thomas Aquinas, or Thomas Aquinas is closer to Karl Barth than Van Til. Van Til affirms both, Thomas affirms one, Barth affirms neither. But when you're asking the question, where is the similarity, precise similarity between Thomas and Barth? No concreated natural knowledge, no concreated natural knowledge. Barth and Thomas agree on that point. Barth also denies natural capacity. But here's what I want you to note. Kant affirms if the reasoning is proper, if it's practical reasoning, he affirms a form of natural capacity. But what did we see in Kant's doctrine of theoretical reason? He likewise denies concreated not natural knowledge of God. He denies it. It's not possible. Knowledge of God cannot be attained through theoretical reason. The only capacity that you have to attain it is in practical reason. But the point is that when it comes to theoretical knowledge, when it comes to the nature of reason itself, there is no natural, concreated, gifted knowledge of God. And what does that do? Let me see if we can start to see a similarity here. Van Til is distinguished from all of these three in that he affirms both capacity and implanted knowledge. Kant is closer to Thomas than he is to Van Til. Kant affirms a form of natural capacity. Kant denies concreated knowledge. Thomas affirms natural capacity. Thomas denies concreated knowledge. And so does Barth. So when you look at it this way, here's what's so ironic. Thomas Aquinas is a realist. Immanuel Kant is an idealist. And there are substantial differences between realism and idealism that we intimated earlier in the opening lecture. But the point is, with all those differences notwithstanding, when you focus it on the question of how man, as man, relates to God in knowledge, they unite against the Reformed view represented by Calvin, Westminster Standards, Van Til, Bavinck, and Voss. And so as you start to categorize views of reason in relation to the revelation of God, there is an alliance that starts to develop between Thomas and Kant on the one side, and between Kant and Barth on the other side. And those differences rest in that they all share a baseline denial of naturally implanted knowledge of God in the sensus divinitatis. So what does that indicate? Well, it indicates, contrary to popular opinion, that Van Til's theology of the natural knowledge of God, Van Til's doctrine of the knowledge of God, stands out as categorically distinctive over against Thomas, Barth, and Kant, who all unite in a denial of what constitutes the heart, the natural theological heart of the deeper Protestant conception. And so as you ask the questions, with all of the differences that exist between a medieval Thomas, an Enlightenment Kant, a 20th century Karl Barth, the thing that unites here is a common denial of the doctrine of the sensus divinitatis, and the way that that doctrinal commitment of the census flows into a Reformed doctrine of the covenant, and how in all three cases, Thomas is not a covenant theologian. Instead of covenant, you need a donum super additum. Barth is not a covenant theologian in the sense that he denies altogether the existence of the covenant of works. And Kant is not a covenant theologian, does not have a place for it. Kant is a Pelagian, as is well known. So, in a fascinating way, the medieval scholastic development in Thomas that leads directly, according to Pope Pius V, to Trent, has no place in its anthropology for natural religious fellowship with God, natural revelation inherent. Kant, in the Enlightenment, has no place for that. Barth has no place for that. And that starts to help you see that no matter how else they might differ, they all unite in that none of them can express the deeper Protestant conception of man's natural religious relation to God, natural religious fellowship with God, and the way that such natural religious fellowship finds its home only in covenant theology, only in federalism. And so as you think about this then, Van Til is correct to insist that whatever the differences are between thinkers as diverse as Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, and Karl Barth, he was correct to show that none of them can lay claim to the Reformed Trinitarianism and federalism that was centered in Van Til's expression of the representational principle. And so what do we say with Kant? What do we say about Van Til in his relation to Kant? Van Til cannot be a Kantian for at least as many reasons as he cannot be Thomistic and he cannot be Barthian. There's just no place in Van Til's system for a denial of the central religious significance of natural concreated knowledge in the fellowship of God that only covenant extends and can bring to consummation pending perfect obedience.